Okay, so I don't really know where to start with this. It's a bit of a personalised kind of trip as well as a factual one. So I hope you will bear with me. It covers the computer literacy project by the BBC and the British government, and basically they wanted the UK to be the most computer literate place in the world. Basically, so the UK as a whole being ahead of the game as far as IT and microcomputers were. So from that point of view, I'm going to look at it as to whether it worked. But from a personal point of view, I'm going to make a start before this even happened, because a lot of the timelines, especially in the UK, seem to be around the start of this project, and I don't think that's really where it started. So let's sort of wind it back a little bit, or a few years. So at around about 1980, I went to a large school, and there was about 1,300 students in this school, so it was quite a big school really. And it was the time where I was getting very interested in electronics. I was reading magazines such as Maplin's Electronics, and there were other publications such as Practical Wireless out there, which had Clive Sinclair was a contributor. He was, he did his projects and he did his pieces within that magazine, and his name pops up throughout kind of the microcomputing history right from the early onset. And because of this interest in microelectronics and computers and projects and things around that kind of ilk, it's where I got my kind of first look at microcomputers, because before then they weren't really mainstream, they weren't really around. Now this school was probably so far ahead of its time, I didn't realise it at the time, but thinking back it was, because they had a computer room which had about 20 computers in there, and which was a lot when you consider, even in kind of the early boom of computers in schools, people would have one or two in a classroom. This had a computer room with 20 plus machines, and can you imagine kind of the look that I would have had on my face when I saw 20 machines in a room all running? And these computers weren't BBC Micros. This was long before the BBC Micro kind of hit the scene. They were video genies, the TRS-80 Model 1 clone, and they kind of looked like a very cheap kind of TRS-80 knockoff, if you pardon my expression, because the cases look like they've been kind of fabricated by a woodworker. But it's, at the time, they were awe-inspiring. They were at the height of technology, and seeing so many in a room was mind-blowing to a small child of 11 years old. So it was an interesting time, but these computers were not something that you would use, because they were designated for use for taking your exams and studying computer science, which you wouldn't have done for a year or so down the line. So to me that was a bit of a, I can't wait that long, I need to get hold of them somehow. But the other thing this school had was quite a few Commodore PETs dotted about in science labs and biology labs and physics labs and things like that. So I was able to kind of talk somebody into using a Commodore PET within my lunch breaks and after school and so on. So me and a friend would use this machine and write games on it and programs and learn how it worked, and which is where it all started off. And that's how the computer revolution really started, and it was for children learning how they worked. Now you're looking at 11-year-old kid basically programming games on a Commodore PET, and Commodore PET had been out for a couple of years prior to that. So as I said, this school was quite progressive because they've had these machines for at least a few years. So I was lucky in a way, and so were the people who were interested in them. Now the boom in computers came because of this the computer literacy project, because we all know, or a lot of you know, that the BBC Corporation, Broadcasting Corporation, decided to make a project of this and make it kind of work going forward. But it was a video or a production called The Mighty Micro which kicked it all off. It wasn't the BBC. And this program was a year or so before the BBC even got involved, but it sparked their interest. And this is a program that I saw when I was quite young, and it was a program I kind of stuck in my head, and I thought, this looks really interesting and I would like to get involved with this, but they're going to cost a lot of money, and most people didn't have the thousands of pounds that you needed to spend on this kit. But with the advent of the companies such as Sinclair Research, things started to move along, because Clive Sinclair was really the architect to what we see as the microelectronics boom and the microcomputer boom, because he placed his products in stores, in places such as newsagents, where you could walk in, buy your daily newspaper, a novel, your pens, your stationery, and alongside that, a home computer, which was unheard of at the time, and it got everything into the mainstream. Now, this was at around the time that the computer literacy project was kicking off, and it had government backing. It had the backing of Margaret Thatcher, and it was something that was going to kind of explode in its own right. And the main reason the government got involved was because heavy industry, the same throughout most of the world at the time, was a dying thing, and because it was tailing off, they needed something to replace it with, and microelectronics, computer electronics, seemed to be the way to go. So from a governmental point of view, it was a good distraction, and it was a good way of getting people into a different area of manufacturing. And I'm guessing that was more of their point of view rather than the programming and the more technical side of it. They saw it as a new industry. Now, the BBC must have seen it as a burgeoning industry, but I think they also saw it as a way of creating viewers for up and coming hardware and for up and coming technology, because they had programs such as Tomorrow's World running at the same time, which dealt with up and coming technology, not necessarily the microcomputer. Now, the BBC was very good, I mean really good, at making people aware of this, because it was the major channel on British television at the time, and everybody knew the BBC, and you could trust in Auntie Beeb, which is their nickname for the channel, which it got, such as the nickname Clive Sinclair got is Uncle Clive, because people warmed to these corporations. Now, the BBC didn't start off with promoting the BBC Micro. It started off with various machines, because it couldn't be seen as favouring one computer over another, because they had a charter to which means that it's a non-commercial charter, which they couldn't be seen to be favourites or provide favouritism for one product or another. So some of the initial programs were based upon various machines, various hardware. The Commodore PET was featured, the ZX81 was featured, the Lynx was featured, so was the Auric products, Tangerine. They were all featured at one stage or another, and it was much more of a general program. So if you've been following the computer program remake I've been doing, it was loosely based around the original BBC program. But what I try to do is bring it up to a more contemporary kind of pitch, because the young boys and girls and children today are possibly more computer literate in a way than we were back then. But we'll come to that in a little while. So, BBC started rolling out with their literacy project, and then they needed, prior to the TV series going live, they needed a machine which was capable of doing what they wanted, and it had to fit around their specs. Now, at the time, Newbury, with their New Brain, or Grundy as it later became known as, Grundy New Brain, were the front runners. And remember when I said that these names keep popping up? Clive Sinclair, his company, Sinclair Radionics, were the actually architects for the Grundy or the New Brain machine. So basically his design was already out there, and when Sinclair Radionics got split up and sold off, these design went to Newbury, which then produced the New Brain, and was later Grundy, which produced the New Brain. So it kind of gets carried on. So Sinclair was the architect on that machine to start off with. So the Grundy was, or the Newbury machine, or the New Brain, wasn't actually ready at that point. And to be completely honest, the actual premise for the New Brain was kind of a mix between the ZX81 and the Sinclair Spectrum. So it was never going to really do what the BBC wanted it to do in reality. And this is where Acorn stepped in, with Chris Curry and Herman Hauser, and they managed to get a computer working to the specs that the BBC wanted, and that became the BBC Micro. It was originally going to be called the Proton, but it became the Micro, and it was kind of a slightly cut down version of the Proton on a single processor instead of a dual processor system. But you know, it was a very powerful machine because the specs that the BBC gave to them were quite highly advanced, but they weren't as advanced as the machine they're producing, and the BBC Micro became a very, very competent and technically advanced machine. Now, these machines worked into schools because of the program and the BBC computer literacy program. Their schools adopted this machine, and that school I mentioned at the beginning adopted the BBC Micro as well. So I never really got to grips with the Video Genie machines until I bought a TRS-80 a little bit further down the line. I actually bought a System 1, but I never had a Video Genie myself, which is quite a bit of a shame because that's something I would like. You know, it's one of those things that you'd like to have, but you kind of haven't got around to getting it, or you haven't found one yet. Now, the Video Genies were probably stuffed in a cupboard somewhere and forgotten about, because the BBC was a much more capable machine, and with the BBC branding behind it, it took off, and that's when at least one computer in every school kind of appeared, which was still behind the curve of the school I actually went to. But you know, I didn't realise it at the time. You just don't think about that when you're in the middle of it. So BBC Micro really had a big foothold because of this, the computer literacy project, and it did a lot of good. It did a lot of good in the fact that people were being pushed computer studies, computer science, and it was quite a thing to do. It wasn't a thing for everybody. People seem to think that everybody back in, that era were studying computer studies, computer science, but it wasn't. Out of maybe an entire year, you're probably looking out of a school of about 1,300 people. You're looking at a few hundred across that year who would go on to do computer studies exam and so on. But it was a lot more than ever had been done previously, where it was just a handful. And that made a difference because they went on to do college courses and university courses, and they became the programmers and the architects of what we have now. And that is almost certainly down to the BBC Micro and the BBC Broadcasting Corporation. And that's one thing where, we should be looking back, not at these programs as being a little bit twee or a little bit outdated, but we should be looking back at them with that's what started it off. Now, the BBC Micro itself was a cracking machine, but the problem is it was very niche, and other countries didn't particularly get the BBC Micro because I tried to do it in America. It didn't quite work. There were a few NTSC versions of the Micro out there, but it never really took off. It was almost wholly a British thing. But what the BBC Micro in schools did was promote other machines such as your Sinclair Spectrums, your ZX81s, your Dragon 32s, your Commodore 64s, your Lynx machines, your Auric or Tangerine machines, and it would make people go out and want one and buy one. And the people who went out and bought them originally didn't predominantly play games. They tried to learn how to program on them, and that's how it started off. And the programming side of it took off. It took off widely. People didn't have to go and do computer science at school. They could teach it themselves. And that's how a lot of the programs, especially in the UK, started off, was teaching themselves, writing games and publishing them. And that, to me, was a great thing, because the variety of software out there and variety of entertainment games and other packages from the UK alone kind of rivaled and was better than other parts of the world, because we seem to take the Micro to heart. Not only the UK, but then there was other parts of Europe that took the Micro to its heart as well. So this literacy program wasn't just a UK thing. It was later spread to Spain and so on, but it was a good few years down the line. And it got spread to other parts of the world via the reception that the UK gave it, and also the appearance on the market of cheap microcomputers because of it. Remember, volume brings prices down, and prices coming down will actually generate sales and interest, and that's predominantly what happened. Now, a lot of people say that the computer science section using predominantly BBC Micros was a step that we should have got away from a lot earlier, because we started off with the PCs coming in, the IBM PCs and the IBM clones coming into the marketplace, and that predominantly was where the market was aiming to go anyway, and it was going to happen because of its compatibility. But the British schools held on to the BBC for quite a long time. They held on it through the BBC Model B, the BBC 64K Plus, and then the BBC Master, which to a greater degree all ran each other's software. Okay, there were a few issues with the Master, but generally you could tweak it so it could run each other's software, which kept schools happy because they didn't have to throw away all of their back catalogue of educational software. And it was a good time because people went out and bought the Acorn Electron off the back of the BBC, regardless of the kind of ultimate market failure of the Acorn Electron. It wasn't because there wasn't a market there, it was because of Acorn's timing of getting it to market and how late it was. The Acorn Electron gained a lot of sales due to the BBC Micro. And because it ran BBC Basic, people were using it at home to do their studies and schoolwork on, especially if they went into computer science, computer studies. And it had a knock-on effect. And it was kind of a Wild West kind of scenario at the time, because until the BBC Micro kind of cemented itself into schools and colleges at the time, there was too many models out there to make people write software for the educational market, because you had everything from TRS-80 clones through to small home micros, including the Dragon 32, you had the BBC, some schools adopted the ZX81 at some point, and the Spectrum, and it was too mishmashed, it wasn't tidy enough. And with the literacy program and Acorn pushing that segment of the market, it improved everything immeasurably, and students around the country got very similar education, very similar lessons, very similar software, which helped because they were all now starting to be taught on the same page, which was brilliant, because fragmentation is never a good thing, which we all know that the IBM PCs and their ilk kind of took that and bundled it up and made sure that there was no fragmentation in the hardware market. So the whole literacy project was really, really good. Not just for the microcomputer itself, but for the whole computer industry, because off the back of the literacy program we got programmers, we got coders and tinkerers, we got developers, hardware engineers, and we were so much ahead of the curve at one point, or the UK was, that's where we thought that everyone was going to go, and we thought that that's how it was going to continue. So when I went through college, it kind of moved on to the IBM PC, and the IBM PC had been in colleges since the mid-80s, so it wasn't that long after the BBC had been launched, and the traction for the IBM PC and IBM clones has been there ever since, and that's what you were taught on predominantly in colleges and universities. It was no longer the BBC's foothold, but the groundwork was already there. The groundwork from the literacy program, the groundwork from using BBC Micros, the groundwork from learning basic and structured programming as well. All the groundwork was there. And remember, up until the mid-1980s, it was all about learning how to program, how to use these machines. So, I mean, a lot of people do think about those times, and there's been a lot of videos on those times, and there's very few videos on kind of the start of it, and especially from a personal point of view, because if it wasn't for a school that was ahead of the curve, and if it wasn't for the BBC Literacy Project, which was ahead of the curve, and if it wasn't for the BBC Micro, which the computer itself was way ahead of the curve, would we really be where we were at the start of the 90s? And I don't think we would have been. I think we would have been kind of catching up. But the problem is, after the 90s, sort of 1989 onwards, is where things started to flounder, because standardization of the IBM PC and its packages caused the UK Education Department to move away from computer studies into ICT, which was basically how to use the packages rather than how to program, how they work, how to make them do things. It was using packages such as bog standard Microsoft stuff, and it was a step back. Whoever brought this into fruition meant that they were basically chopping off our lead at its knees. So we were cutting dead the lead that the UK had, because they thought that learning to use packages was better than learning how to create. And that's what I think kind of put the UK back on a bit more of a level pegging with the rest of Europe, because the Europeans were doing a very similar thing. The USA was doing a very similar thing, and we were no longer ahead, which is a bit of a shame. But the legacy of the BBC Micro, the Computer Literacy Project, and all of the micros that were out at the time meant that people who learnt coding in their own time moved on. They moved into jobs. So what we saw was that from the legacy of this project was that people who had been through the 1980s, through university, college, etc., were now in the mainstream as productive employees, or they set their own businesses up and so on. So we kind of had a bit of a leap ahead as far as the workplace was, but the education side was dragging. So when the 2000s came, the people who had come out of the education in the 90s, they'd finished off, started in the 90s, early 90s, finished in the 2000s, were behind as far as creations are concerned, as far as programming was concerned. But they knew everything, how to use Microsoft products, which was great if you were going to be an office worker, but it wasn't so good if you were going to design things. So there's a gap, and that gap was caused by not very forward thinking. So the people who'd been through the 80s were now tasked to keep moving it forward by recreating stuff, by inventing new stuff, while the rest of the education system caught up again. And that's what's happened. Computer science has come back into the mainstream over the last 5-6 years now, and they are doing computer science again. And this is where I think we need the Computer Literacy Project to restart, reboot, start again. There's a place for it. And maybe it's not as basic as the original one was. Maybe it shouldn't be. Maybe it should be start off with a little bit more advanced stuff in there, because for example, we know what a computer is now. We know how to use them, or we know how to interact with them. But what we need to do is be able to inspire the next generation of architects, next generation of programmers, next generation of software writers and so on, to be able to move it forward again. And then let's see where we are in the next 10-15 years. So something like the literacy project should come back. It should come back, and it should be reinvented for the 21st century. That's quite a personal take on it, but it's also an accurate take on it. But it's the personal side that seems to be starting to get lost in translation, because, as I think I've said before, people who were around at the time when everything exploded and everything kicked off and the whole microcomputer scene kicked off are now moving on. Some of the people are no longer here anymore, especially the very early adopters through the 70s. And it seems a shame that that side of it should be lost. So if there's any more stories that anyone have got out there about that time and upwards, it'd be great to hear, and it would be also nice to try and put something together for them as well. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this kind of personal timeline and insight into what it was like through that period. And I hope you subscribe, and we'll take this forward and have some more videos very shortly. Okay, thank you very much.